Hey guys, in this video we're going to be doing a no-sew quilted Easter egg just like this one. So you'll notice in this Easter egg we've got an offset band that's closer to the base of the egg than it is to the top. So we've got a lot more layers here from the narrow end down than we do from the base up. So this is the example that we're going to be doing today. I do have a couple of future videos coming to this channel, so be sure you are subscribed, showing some different variations of Easter eggs. And for example, this is one of them. This has the band, which is a little bit more centered. It's hard to get a band perfectly centered on an Easter egg because they're not perfectly symmetrical. Of course, there's a wide end and a narrow end, but there are different ways that you can vary this up to create different looks like you're seeing here. You don't even have to do top to bottom if you don't want to. We've got some patterns like this where the design goes from the center of the egg outward to the edge rather than from top to bottom. So really the possibilities with these are totally endless, and they're a lot of fun because you can really play around with colors and decorations. So you can see on these I've got some paper flowers. Those are really pretty. You can do beads and sequins and all sorts of things. This one has a bow on top. Really, the possibilities are endless. Now, to help you get started with some ideas for this example that we're going to be doing here today, we made you this awesome little coloring sheet and planner. Now, again, this is based off the design I'm going to be showing you today with the offset band here, and it does have the exact same number of layers that I'm going to be doing here. And so it's really handy because it tells you the amount of rows, it tells you how many pieces per row, which you're about to see me demonstrate, the size of the pieces, and you can just kind of lay out how you want to do your egg. And you can even color it in if you want to, so you can kind of get an idea of what your colors are going to look like before you lay fabric to foam. This is totally free for you. You can find a link right below where you can get it. All right, let's go ahead and talk about what you're going to need in order to make this. So first of all, fabric. The amount of fabric that you are going to need is going to depend on how many rows you plan to do in each fabric, and really how many rows you plan to do anyway. So I've got a lot of rows here on this egg, and I've got a total of 88 pieces of fabric, and they're 2" by 3" rectangles. And by the way, that's roughly 2 by 3 inches. They don't have to be perfect. You can see here, mine are like kind of all different sizes. You can totally use scraps for these. So you can use that planning sheet to help you figure out how many pieces of each color that you're actually going to end up needing. If you want to lay out like what kind of fabrics you want to use and then write them in on these rows here where there's like a space for notes, then you can look over here and see how many pieces that row takes and then add up each of those rows to determine how many of each fabric you're actually going to need for the egg. All right, so 2" by 3" rectangles, roughly. And then also you're going to need a band. Now my band is 12 inches long. That's long enough to wrap around this size of egg. We'll talk about the egg too in a second. But you just need a piece of fabric that's going to be long enough to wrap around the width of the egg wherever you plan to put your band. And as far as the width of my fabric, it's about 1.5 inches to 1 3/4 inches wide. It doesn't have to be very wide. We're going to be folding it down to create this nice neat finish and cover all of our raw edges and pins at that point. All right, and the egg. So I'm using a 4-inch tall egg. My egg is pre-marked into 8 sections. These lines are really going to help to keep everything straight as we're working from top to bottom. And then when we start at the bottom and go up more towards the top, if you don't have a lined egg, that's okay. It's not absolutely necessary. You're just going to have to really pay attention to keeping things straight. And we'll talk about that as we're working our way through making the egg. Or you can actually mark your own lines if you want to, if you don't have an egg like this. We've got another video on the YouTube channel that will show you how to mark your own foam egg into 8 equal segments. We've even got a printable template for that. So that'll make things a lot easier. Or you can get an egg like this if you would like. We had these custom made and they are available in the Ornament Girls shop. You can use any size egg for these. I do want to clarify that. You can use any size eggs that you want. You're just going to have more or less rows depending on if your egg is smaller or larger. And we cannot forget about pins. You're going to need a whole bunch of pins. So for this variation with all these pieces and rows that I've got here, I'm probably gonna be using about 350 pins. It is 4 pins per rectangle of fabric. So once you figured out how many fabrics you're using, you can actually do the multiplication times 4 pins per piece and figure out exactly how many pins you're going to need. And of course, if you're going to be doing less rows or you're going to be spacing them apart more like what you're seeing here, you will need a lot less pins. Now that was pins per piece, but don't forget you're going to need a couple of pins to hold your band into place, and you will also need whatever pins that are necessary for your embellishments. So I've got some beads in here and I used a pin for each of those. If you're going to be putting on any bows or ribbons or anything like that, keep in mind you may need pins for those. That brings us to embellishments. You're going to need whatever it is that you want to decorate your egg with, and really the possibilities are endless for decorating these. You're seeing beads and flowers here. Here's a sequin. Here's one with a bow. We've got a pretty trim wrapped around this outside of this egg. Here is a trim that I cut apart and put around the band. So really, I mean, you can just go to town with ideas for embellishing these. And last but not least, you will need a couple of tools. You're going to need a flexible tape measure, something like this, just to help you keep things even as you're working your way from top to bottom. Now, as you start to get used to doing this, it becomes very easy to eyeball. You won't really need to use a tape measure, but it can really help in the beginning to keep your rows evenly spaced. And of course, you're going to need some scissors. All right, guys, so that's everything, I think. Let's go ahead and get started with making it. All right, so we're going to begin with the color that we want on the very tippy top of the egg, the narrow end of the egg. I'm going to be using this cream color with the little pink polka dots. We want to start with this held upside down, so pattern side facing away. And we're going to fold the top edge over just a little bit, like maybe a 1/2 inch or so. You do not have to be exact with this part. And then we want to take our first pin and pin it right through the top center, just a hair below the top folded edge. You want a little teeny lip of fabric to show above the pin head. And we're going to pin this into the top of your egg. Now, if you've got a lined egg, this is way easier because you've got all those lines are converging right there in the center, and that gives you the center point, right? And I'm sorry again because I realize that there is a light flashing off of this and it's kind of hard to see, but you're going to press your pin right there into the center where all those lines are converging, and you want the top folded edge of your piece of fabric to be in line with one of those lines. All right, so right here I've got my top folded edge is in line with one of those lines. Now, if you don't have a lined egg, it's a little bit more difficult, but you can just eyeball it. You're still gonna have an okay result. I used to make these all the time without lined eggs. I did see a little trick, and I can't remember where I saw it, but somebody had said that you can take some pencil on a piece of paper and just make some pencil, like smudge the pencil on there a little bit, and then you can hold this upside down and just sort of scratch the very top of your egg on that pencil, and it'll give you a little smudge on the top, and it'll show you where the top of your egg is. Be careful with this because if you've got light colored fabric, you don't want to be able to see the pencil through it. Just do it really lightly. Or you can, like I said, you can just eyeball it and you should be okay. Just look at it from the top and try to eyeball the very center. But if you got the lined eggs, it really does make it easier. And again, guys, I've got a link below to another video that we've got that will show you how to draw your own lines if you do not have lines on your egg. All right, so let's move forward. Okay, so we're gonna create a triangle out of this. We wanna take the left side, everything to the left of your pin, and fold it straight down in a straight line down to the bottom of the rectangle, and you're forming half of a triangle. And then we're gonna take the right side and do the same, but we're gonna just barely overlap the left side with the right side so that you've got one line going down the center of your triangle. Now we also want to line up this line with the line on the foam below. And if you kept your top folded edge in line with this line, then the line that you've created down the center is going to be lined up with the line that's perpendicular to that line. All right, and it'll be just like this. Now that overlap that I just told you to do, you want it to be just enough so that you can fit one pin or pin one pin through both layers to hold them both down in place. You don't want to overlap too much like this because it's going to pull your triangle out of shape. See how out of whack that is? And then my line down the center is not straight. This is especially important if you are not using a lined egg. You want to keep your triangle as straight as possible. And the way to do that is to do just a barely little tiny bit of overlap there in the center. The reason I do the overlap is to save pins. In the older method of doing no-sew ornaments, people would pin both sides separately and then you have to use 2 pins, and I just don't see the point of that. Not to mention that sometimes you accidentally get a gap between, and I don't like that either. I like it to look nice and neat, and I like to save pins, especially on something like this where you're going to be using like 300 or 400 pins. You want to save pins where possible. So I totally messed mine up from showing the wrong way. So starting over, and I'm going to go ahead and pin this right in the bottom center through both halves to hold them in place, like this. And now I'm going to smooth down the left side. Oops, my pin kind of turned on me when I was putting it in. Pin down there in the left bottom corner, and then the same in the right. All right, first piece done. Now that's all we're gonna do for literally the entire egg. We're gonna be doing that over and over and over again. So I'm gonna move to my next piece, which is gonna be directly opposite this one. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the same exact thing. I'm holding it with the pattern side facing away and then folding over that top edge just a little bit, about 1/2 inch or so, and then pinning through the top center, just a hair below the top folded edge. I'm gonna go directly opposite. I want the point of my new triangle to sit directly opposite of my first point. When I pin this into the center, I want my pin to sit just against the tip of the first point, but not pierce it. I want it to touch it, but not pierce it. And then when I've got that where I want it, I'm gonna push it flat in just like before. And you'll see if you did that right, if you put your if you put your pin against the tip of the first triangle, then now when you press it flat, you're gonna see that the lip above your pin overlaps the tip of the first triangle just a tiny bit, and that is what we want. The reason why is because when we go to create our triangle, if those are touching like that, if that part of the rectangle is overlapping this, that means you're gonna have no gap between the 2 points, and that is what we want. We don't want to have foam showing when we're done this layer. All right, so same thing, I fold down my left and right sides, overlapping the left side with the right side just a tiny bit, pinning through both halves to hold them in place. And I forgot to mention, but you do want to make sure that that line that you've created down the center is lining up with the line on the foam. If you don't have lines, just make sure that it's lining up really straight with the line in the first triangle. You can even use a tape measure and just make sure that everything is lining up really straight with each other. I'm going to go ahead and pin down my outer corners just like before. All right, first 2 pieces done. We're going to do that 2 more times to fill in those 2 remaining spots. Same exact fold. And now I'm going to do the same thing, making sure that my pin is touching the tips of those first 2 triangles, but not piercing them, just touching them. And I'm going to fold down the left side and the right side. And I'm gonna just shift this as needed so that that line in the center is lined right up with the foam line below. Now the 2 outer edges of this triangle are going to overlap the sides of the first 2 triangles, and that is totally fine. We're putting these pieces of fabric on the narrow end of the egg, so of course some overlap is going to happen. Do not even worry about that. All right, we're going to do the exact same thing one more time. All right, same exact thing, making sure that my pin is going right there in that last section, touching all the other fabric. Left side, right side. So let's move on to layer 2. We're switching fabrics. Everything is going to be exactly the same except for this time, and for all the rest of the rows until the very bottom row, we're going to be doing 8 pieces per layer instead of 4. So let's go ahead and start. The fold is exactly the same. We're going to be folding over the top edge just a little bit. and then pinning through the top center. Now for the second layer, I like to come down about 1/2 inch, or at least I'm going to for this particular egg. You can do whatever distance you want. The important thing to remember is whatever distance you come down from the center and begin this row, you want to do the same for every piece of the row. Okay, that way your star will be star-shaped and it'll be even. So whatever distance you decide to come down, just do it for all 8 pieces and you'll be fine. I'm going to be doing about 1/2 inch for this layer, and then I'm probably going to go to about 3/8 of an inch for the remaining layers, because I made all these a little bit skinnier. So coming down about 1/2 inch, and I do also like to begin over my inner pieces from the layer below, and I do this throughout the entire egg, and I do it on most of my patterns. What I mean is, see how the sides of this triangle are partially covered up by the neighboring triangles? That's because we put these pieces on first, and then we put these pieces on second. You're going to have that on every single layer, even the ones with 8, as you're about to see. Just to keep things looking really pretty and consistent and symmetrical from top to bottom, I like to keep this pattern of always covering the inner pieces first and then doing the outer pieces last. It just looks really nice. Now, do you have to do that? No, you do not have to do it, but it's just something I like to do. It's a good habit to get into. Okay, so I'm going to start over one of these 2 pieces first. I'm going to come down about 1/2 inch from the center point, which is where all the points of the first layer converge. And if you want to use a tape measure, and I do recommend that you do this, especially if you have never made these before, you can check to make sure that you are at the right spot. And you'll want to do this for every piece to make sure that every single piece on the layer is the same distance from the center. So pressing that flat down, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm folding the left half down, straight down, and then the right half, just barely overlapping that left half with the right half. And I do again want to make sure that the line that I've created down the center of this triangle is in line with the line on the foam below. And if it's not, you want to straighten it out. If you don't have lined foam, then you do just want to make sure that your line is in line with all the other lines that are below. Okay, just really eyeball it and make sure. The straighter you can keep things now, the more symmetrical everything will stay as you work your way down. And again, just pinning down those corners to hold them in place. All right, now we're going to do the same thing, but directly opposite. So be really careful here that you, when you measure down 1/2 inch, that you measure from your center point and not from the point you just put on. That is something I see people do by accident all the time. And what will happen is, if you measure 1/2 inch down from your point that you just added, you're gonna totally cover up this piece from below, and you're not gonna have a star when you're done. So you wanna come down 1/2 inch from the center point, which will put it 1 inch from the last point. And I keep saying 1/2 inch because that's what I'm doing, but if you're doing a different measurement, then whatever measurement it is that you're doing is what you want to do here, of course. Pinning right through the center of that opposite triangle, and then folding down the left side and the right side. And then just making sure that center line is in line with the line on the foam. All right, first 2 pieces down. We're going to do 2 more directly opposite. All right, so again, coming down 1/2 inch from my very center point, about right there. Now I'm going to do 1 more directly opposite of that, and I'll be halfway done with this layer after this piece. Okay, so now we want to do 4 more triangles, and this time we're going to be putting them between the 4 that we just did. That means that their center points are going to be sitting between the triangles from the very first layer. So same exact thing, prepping our fabric the exact same way. And we are going to come down the same distance from the center point, but this time between these triangles. So see, my pin is basically right there on the line between those two triangles. Now I'm a little bit off. If you have to kind of go to the left or right of the line a little bit, that's okay, because see what happens here from the first layer is, since these pieces were being folded down around a curved surface and it's pretty narrow up here, sometimes those lines didn't stay perfectly dead center down the middle. Again, that's fine, but you do want this piece to be in the middle because it'll look a little wonky if you put these pins kind of off to the side a little bit. You want the point of this triangle to be dead smack in the center and aiming right at the middle of the egg. Folding down my left and right sides just like always. Now watch this line. You really want to look at the line on the foam here and make sure that it's still nice and straight. And you want to make sure that this point is aiming directly at your center point. Okay, again, this line here might be a little bit kind of weird looking and it might have a little curve to it like mine does, but as long as your point is aiming directly at your center point and therefore directly between these two triangles, you're okay. You really want to watch that though. All right, and we're going to do that 3 more times to cover the rest of the spaces that are open. We're going to do one here, and then here and here. So now we can see that star shape in the center. All right, so that is layer 2. We're gonna be moving on now to our 3rd fabric. Let's see, for me, I'm moving on to this light pink color, and it looks like I left another 1/2 inch or so between this layer and my 3rd layer. So that's what I'll do. And then it looks like after that is when I started getting skinny. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab my next piece of fabric, which for me is this. Now I'm gonna come down 1/2 inch like I said, but you please feel free to do however you want. You can make a wider row, you can make them skinnier. Here in this one, it looks like I did the same width for my star, and then it looks like I went even a little bit wider for the 2nd layer, and then I got skinny in these layers. So you can totally experiment and try different things out, whatever it is that you want to do. Just like I described before though, I do like to make sure that I start over my inner pieces first. It's very easy to see that in this layer. Maybe not with this fabric so much. This is a busy fabric, but you can see it if you're looking at your fabrics. You can really see those inner pieces it's very clear because they're like almost completely covered up. There's only a tiny little bit of them showing. I'm gonna do my first 4 pieces in this new 3rd layer over those tiny pieces first. Same prep as always. There's one of my inner pieces right there. So I'm gonna come down about 1/2 inch from the point of that piece. And I'll go ahead and grab my tape measure and double check. That looks about right. Oh, I'm a little off. I know it's hard to see with this busy fabric. Pressing it flat down and then just creating my triangle the same as before. I like this light pink and kind of tonal fabric in contrast to that busy fabric above it. That looks really cool. All right, and I'm making sure my line is lined up with the line on the foam below. Now I'm going to come over here and do the exact same thing directly opposite. Here was my first one. I'm just traveling right across the top. I'm going to put my next point right here. Coming down about 1/2 inch from this point. I better double check and make sure that I'm 1/2 inch. Yep. So I just kind of did that piece without describing what I was doing, but of course I'm going over the opposite 2 inner pieces now. And now I'm going to do the one last inner piece over here. Right there. All right, so there's the first 4 pieces of row 3, and now we've got these chunks in between of those 4 pieces that we're going to cover up. Same exact thing, we're going to come down 1/2 inch from those points and place our points right here. And always watch those center lines. All right, so I'm coming opposite of this one now. I didn't measure, and I can see that I think this one is not quite 1/2 inch now that I'm looking at this one. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this around and redo it. Alrighty, so 2 more to go to finish this layer. And I'm sure you're starting to see the pattern now. It's basically the same thing over and over and over again to create each layer. All right, there is layer 3. So in this layer, it's a little bit easier to see those inner and outer pieces here on my example because the fabric is a lot less busy. So just in case you couldn't really see that before when I was describing it, it's a lot more simple to see it here. This is an inner piece where the points or the corners are a little bit covered up, actually a lot covered up by these neighboring 2 pieces. So I always just call these inner pieces, and then these are outer pieces. Super creative, right? So we're going to start the next layer over top of those inner pieces again, just like before. And we're going to be switching to, let's see, I've got this slightly darker pink next. So that's this one for me. And this time I am going to come down a little bit less. I think I'm going to come down by, I think 3/8 of an inch this time instead of 1/2 of an inch. So just a tiny bit less, just it's a very small amount, but it'll make a little bit of a difference in the finished egg. It'll give it the look that I'm looking for. So starting over one of these inner pieces, coming down from the point of the last layer, and I'm just going to grab my tape measure, and that's about what I want, about 3/8 of an inch. I do want to center this a little bit, so about there. It's a really subtle difference between these two pinks, but you can still see it. It looks pretty cool on a finished one. All right, and then I'm gonna flip it over and do the exact same thing. And as always, I'm just going opposite, 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 opposite. I'll probably speed up the video through some of these next couple of parts because you've already seen me doing it, and then I will be back. All right, layer 4 is all done. Now we're gonna switch to layer 5, and for this one I went back to my light pink again. So I had pink, dark pink, light pink. I'm gonna go ahead and switch to that. Same exact thing. I'm gonna come down the same exact distance again, so it was about that 3/8 of an inch or so. So I'm gonna start over my inner pieces, and then I'm gonna do the outer pieces. All right, there's the end of that layer. So my next layer is going to be the dotted. I've got, it looks like 4 more layers to go. You have to be committed to make one of these. And again, I'm gonna probably speed up the video. By now you see the whole entire pattern. We're gonna keep on going until we get down to the last layer here on this half, which is gonna be, for me, the pink. So I'm gonna do 4 more layers sped up. And then when I go to flip it over and start the other side, I will slow the video back down and we'll go from there. So really quick, guys, you may have noticed this little cheat I'm doing. Instead of pinning off the egg, folding down my top edge of my fabric and pinning through the top center and then putting it on the egg, once you get pretty good at eyeballing, which by now you might be an expert after all these layers, you can just do it right on the egg. So like this, I'm taking my fabric, folding down that top edge, and laying it right where I know it's going to be sitting on the egg. And this just makes it a little quicker. You can see I'm not really like setting down and picking up my egg over and over again when I do it this way. So it's up to you, whatever you find easiest. If it's easier for you to do it the way I showed in the beginning, that works too. Look how porky this guy is getting around the middle, all these layers of fabric. And you really need to take that into account when you are measuring your piece of fabric for the band. And that's why in the beginning I had told you that mine had took a 12-inch strip of fabric to wrap around the egg. If you go to wrap a piece of fabric around the blank egg, you might think, well, gosh, it only takes, 9 inches or something like that. But you do really need to account for the thickness that gets built up after you put all these layers on. All right, we've got just a couple layers to go here. All right, so I'm only gonna do one more layer now on this part of the egg, so this tall part of the egg, before we go ahead and switch to the bottom and start working our way back up. And there's only a couple layers on this side. Thank goodness, right? Are your fingers screaming yet? So I'm gonna be switching back to this, my main color of the egg. Alrighty, so the biggest part of the egg is done. My thumb is purple. We're gonna go ahead and turn this over and begin the base. So I only did 3 layers on the base of my example egg. I did the paisley and then the dots and then the pink floral. So I'm gonna do the same here for this one. And I'm prepping my rectangle exactly the same way. So one thing that I want to make sure I do here when I'm placing my first layer of pieces is I want my inner pieces of this bottom half of the egg to match the inner pieces from the top half. And in looking at this, I can see, of course, as always, which pieces are my inner pieces. Like here's one right here. Here's one, okay, and then this is an outer piece. So to make sure that I get started correctly, I want my first 2 pieces in the bottom here to align with an inner piece from the whole top of the egg. So if I flip this over, here's this inner piece, and I go to put this into the bottom of the egg. Here's my center where all those lines are converging. What I want to happen is I want my center line of the triangle that I'm about to form to align with the center line of an inner triangle from up here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I put my piece straight down into the middle where all the lines are converging, folding down my left half and my right half. And now I've got a new center line here in the middle of my brand new triangle, and I want that to align right up through the center of all those inner triangles from this part of the egg. And I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place as always, and I'm just going to go ahead and continue the same way as I've done all along. Now you're going to find very quickly, it's already happening to me on this very first layer. It might not happen to you yet, it might be the second layer, but you'll see that your bottoms of your triangles are going to start to overlap the part of the egg that you've already done. And that's fine, and it's going to happen. We're only going to have room for just a couple layers down here, and we knew that. But we do want to make sure that we don't pin too high into this fabric. That's not happening yet. Even here, it's not like coming up here into this part of the egg. So I'm not really worried about it yet, but we don't want any pins like up here, because if you think about it, our band is going to be sitting right here around this area, and we don't want any pins to go past that. It's okay if the fabric goes past that because we can always trim it, but if you've got pins up there, you can't trim it, and then that fabric will be like up here and you won't be able to do anything about it. So just be sure that your pins stay down here, and we can always trim off any excess. This is going to be a lot more obvious, I think, in the next layer, and then especially in the third layer down here on the base. So I'm going directly opposite now. And remember, we want our pin to touch the point of that first triangle, and that's so that we can avoid having a foam gap showing through from beneath. We don't want any foam showing after we get this layer done. And I can't even see the line on my foam here. This might have happened over here too, and I just totally forgot about it. But you can't see the foam, but we can see the line. We know that all these triangles followed that line, and so we know we're following the line as long as this line lines up with those lines. Lines, lines, lines. You want everything to line up. Okay, so there's the first 2, and we're going to go ahead and fill in the remaining 2 gaps. Again, my pin is touching those points. All right, there is the very bottom. Now what I'm going to do is just trim off some of this excess. It's not really an issue yet, but just to avoid some bulk that might happen, I'm just going to get rid of them. The next layer, I know there will be a lot more trimming. All right, so for layer 2, we're going to be switching fabrics again, and this time, of course, we're going to be going back to 8 pieces per row. And it's a little hard to see where the inner and outer triangles are here with this fabric, but if you look closely, you can see that this corner is overlapping right here. Same thing over here, which tells me that this is one of those inner triangles. And if you're really having a hard time seeing, then of course you can always look at your other side. I think I'm gonna come down, I think I'm coming down a little less than I did up here, so probably 3/8 of an inch. I want to show a little less down here just because I don't have as much room. So, and I still need to fit another whole layer in. So I'm going to come down about 3/8 of an inch here for each of these 8 pieces in this layer. And again, I cannot see the line on the foam anymore. That's done, but I can see the lines going up the egg. So that's what I'm going to look at now while I'm forming those triangles. And this time I'm really watching my pins, because if I pinned all the way down here, it would be going too high up on the opposite side of the egg, and I don't want that. So I'm keeping my pins up a little higher on my triangle, leaving all of this hanging free so that I will be able to easily trim it and keep it nice and neat right there where I want to cover everything with a band. I'll probably trim after the first 4 pieces and then after the last 4 pieces. So I'm coming down the same distance now from the center point. There was my center point. Coming down about 3/8 of an inch. All right, there's the first 4. Let's go ahead and trim these now. It'll be easier to trim the first 4 and then the second 4 separately, because it gets a little bulky once you add all 4 on there, or all 8 on there. So I'm just trimming everything that's below those pins. And I'm not too worried about like being super neat, because remember, our next 4 pieces here are gonna cover like most of these up. Really, you're only gonna see this part of these triangles. So you don't have to worry too much about being nice and neat. But there is something that you do need to worry about, and I should have said this before I started. Make sure you can always see the end of your scissors. Don't do this. If you can't see the end of your scissors, that means don't cut, because otherwise you're going to cut something that you shouldn't. Okay, so always make sure you can see the end before you start to cut. Okay, again, I'm keeping my pins up kind of high so that I can trim when I'm done. Okay, layer 2 is done. We're just going to trim up those last 4 pieces. All right, so we've got 8 pieces to go. 1 more layer. Hallelujah. We're going to go ahead and start this exactly like the other layer, starting over the inner pieces from the last layer and bringing it all together here in the center. And we are going to watch those pins too, just like before, making sure we're not bringing the pins too far into the upper half or upper part of the egg. So I'm going to do my layer here. I'm thinking about this distance, and I think that that is probably 3/8 of an inch. Yeah, looks like about 3/8 of an inch. So that's where I'm gonna space this layer from the last one. And I'm gonna pin, oops, I bent my pin. Ouch, okay. So I'm gonna put my pin here so that it's in line with pretty much where I trimmed my last layer. I'm gonna try to keep all the pins here in this row along that line. So I'll be able to trim that off, and that's where my band is going to sit. I got that pin a little too low, I think. All right. Whew. Now I'm going to go ahead and trim these up and we'll be ready for the band and then embellishments. So putting the band on this offset version of the Easter egg is a little bit more awkward than doing a band on a regular round ornament or even on an egg like this where it's a little bit more centered, because you're going to feel a definite difference between the band on this side where it's a little bit wider and on this side where it's like more narrow. And you'll see what I'm talking about when you go to do this. But we're just going to kind of manipulate the fabric around as we go to make it as snug as possible. So we're going to start with the band. We've got the pattern side facing away, and we're going to create a smaller band out of this with a raw edge running down one side. So we're going to fold this in about a third of the way or so. Now I'm going to talk about adjusting this here in a second, because you can make it more narrow or more wide depending on what you need. But then we're going to fold in the other side the same way. And so what you'll have is a skinnier band with the raw edge running down one side. And when you flip this over, you don't see any raw edges. Now you may find that you need a wider band or a skinnier band depending on what you've got to cover here. I feel like I need a pretty narrow band here because it's going to be awkward with this being like so fat up here and so much smaller here. To make a band that's smaller, you'll fold it in more. So like I could fold this almost in half like this and then fold it almost in half again. And I've got a really skinny band. That might be too skinny. But if you need a wider band, then you'll fold in less. So like maybe fold it in not even to the halfway point, and then fold it again like this, and you'll have a slightly wider band. You can even fold it in less like this, and you'll have an even wider band. Okay, so you can adjust this depending on what you need. I'm gonna do about probably what I did originally. So I folded it in like a third of the way and then folding it again. And I'm just getting a start on it. Obviously we can't fold the whole thing all at once. Sometimes I think I've seen people say they like to iron them. I wouldn't do that on this egg because you're going to have to manipulate it and even narrow it a little bit in some parts so that it wraps around snugly around this awkward shape. So it's easiest just to not iron it for this, at least I feel. So you're going to look at this and decide where you want the front of your egg to be. Let me back up. So I want to have this start and end on the front of my egg. And the reason I want to do that is because I'm going to be putting these flowers and beads on it, and that's going to be my front. Now you might have a different idea in mind for how you're going to decorate your egg, and maybe you want the band to start and stop on the back because maybe you don't want to put like something like this on the front. So you do want to think about that. If that's the case, you're going to need a way to hide the ends of the band, or you can just hide them in the back. You can just turn it around and that can be the back. So think about that before you start. But I'm going to put it on the front so that I can hide the ends of the band with my flowers. And let's see, I think I kind of started it over an inner triangle section on this one, and I like how that looks. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Right here is some of my inner triangles. They're partially covered up here by my neighboring triangles. We'll just go ahead and make this the front. And I'm just going to lay this right over that section of triangles and place a couple of pins in here to hold it down. Like this. All right, so what I'm going to do is just start wrapping this around the egg and folding it as I go. And I am going to have to kind of play with this a little bit to make it so that it lays flat on both sides. It's going to have no problem laying flat on the fat side of the egg, but here on the bottom it's a little more awkward because we're doing this on an angle. So you're just going to have to kind of manipulate and play with this as you work your way around. I'm almost kind of going up and then back to the side again, like back down over my raw edges as I go. And you know, something you can do if you're having a really hard time getting your fabric to lay flat and you feel like you need it to be held down, you could always take beaded pins or sequined pins and decorate the band with those things, and it'll also do double duty and hold your band in place. This is the weird thing about doing the offset band like this. Looks really cool when it's all done, but it's just awkward putting the band on. So I think I'm happy with that. I've got it pulled pretty snug. I'm pulling it as snug as I can because I want it to stay in place, but trying not to yank it so hard that my flowers like get pulled out of whack. So I think I'm pretty happy with this. Once you are happy with what you've done, you can go ahead and trim off your excess. I pulled that so tight that look how much excess I have. Like I have inches left over. So you might not need as long of a band as what I said in the beginning. And it also depends, of course, on your size foam egg. Oh, before I cut this, there is something else you can do if you don't want this beginning and end to be the front of your egg. You can actually flip over the end. You can cut it off to like, I don't know, where you have like a 1/2 inch left over or so, and you can flip the end under like this and pin it like that, and that will give you a little bit of a nicer and neater edge rather than having a raw edge if this is going to be the back of your egg and you don't have anything else to cover it with. But I am going to cover it, so I'm not really worried about that. I'm just going to do this. I'm going to save this. I can use this for another egg. So, okay, we're gonna go ahead and decorate. So I'm gonna be decorating with the same thing that I did here. I've got some paper flowers and some beads. I've got my beads sitting here. I'm just gonna like thread a couple of beads. I've got pearls and clear beads. I'm gonna thread some of those onto pins and get them ready. Probably, I don't know, 8 or so of the different various beads that I'm gonna use. And I'm gonna prep my flowers. These came on a little stem like this. I'm just gonna snip off the stems. I want them to be flat on my band. I'm gonna get these ready and then we'll stick them on. All right, so I've got some hot glue here. I'm just gonna start gluing these on. I'm just gonna make a little bundle here. My hot glue gun won't reach to where my camera is. So there we go, that's cute. And I'm just gonna stick some beaded pins in and around these. Alright, that is really cute. Came out nice. Came out just like this one. So I hope that you liked doing this. I know your fingers are probably screaming right now, but it's worth it, right? This one was probably a little ambitious if it's your first one. And if you did it, good for you. Hooray for you. But remember that you can always start a little simpler like this one, not as many layers. The possibilities, of course, are endless. And don't forget to get your coloring sheet and planner. The link is right below. As always, if you have any questions, please be sure to let me know in the comments and I will help you out the best that I can. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. Happy ornamenting.